I stared at the notification on my phone, my thumb hovering over the play button while the rain drummed a rhythmic, hollow beat against my office window, and I knew before I even saw the footage that it had happened again. This was the sixth time in 2 months that a package had vanished from my porch at Oak Haven Estates, a neighborhood that sold itself on the dream of, prestige and peace, But as the video buffered, I saw her, Mrs. Beatrice Vanderbilt, the undisputed matriarch and president of our homeowners association, stepping onto my property with the practiced grace of a woman who believed the ground rose up to meet her feet. She didn't oppose. T looked like a thief. She looked like a Sunday school teacher in her crisp, mint green suit, checking her gold watch before casually bending down to scoop up the box containing my daughter's custom-made medical leg braces, tucking them under her arm like a discarded newspaper, and walking away with a smile so serene it made my blood turn to ice. You have to understand, I didn't oppose. T moved to Oak Haven to start a war. I moved here after a messy divorce because I wanted a place where my 10-year-old, Maya, could feel safe and where the lawns were manicured enough to make me forget how chaotic my life had become. But I quickly learned that, manicure, was just a code word for, controlled. Beatrice Vanderbilt wasn't oppose. T, just a neighbor. She was a ghost who haunted every property line, a woman who measured the height of your fescue with a literal ruler and sent out fines for, non-compliant mulch shades, before the sun had even set on moving day. I tried to be the, good neighbor, the guy who nodded and waved and paid his dues on time, but when Maya's braces disappeared, the ones we'd waited months for, the ones that were supposed to help her walk without pain, the polite mask I'd been wearing didn't just slip, it shattered into a million jagged pieces. I remember walking over to her house that first evening, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, thinking that surely this was all just a massive, ridiculous misunderstanding, because who in their right mind steals medical equipment from child? Her house was a fortress of white limestone and perfectly symmetrical topiaries. And when she opened the door, she smelled like expensive lilies and old money, looking at me with those pale, unblinking eyes as if I were a smudge on her windshield. Oh, Arthur, she'd said, her voice a syrupy, rehearsed trill that made my skin crawl, I'm sure I have no idea what you're talking about, but as HOA president, I do occasionally collect stray parcels to ensure our porches remain in oppose, clutter-free in oppose, and in oppose, visually harmonious in oppose, for the prospective buyers touring the area. It's all in the bylaws, dear. Perhaps you should read the fine print instead of accusing your neighbors of larceny, I stood there on her Italian marble steps, clutching my phone with the video footage ready to play, but she just tilted her head and smiled that razor-thin smile, reminding me that her brother-in-law was the county judge and her husband owned the largest firm in the city, essentially telling me that even if I had her on 4K video, she was the law in this zip code, and I was just a tenant with an, unauthorized bird feeder. I went to the police, of course, but the officer at the desk just sighed when he saw the address, telling me that without, proof of intent to deprive, or, recovered physical evidence, it was a civil matter, a neighborhood dispute that didn't oppose. T warranted a squad car, leaving me standing in the station parking lot feeling small, ignored, and dangerously quiet. That's when the violation notices, started appearing on my door, bright orange slips of paper that felt like burning coals, finding me for my trash cans being out 10 minutes past the pickup window, for visible garden hose, and for the unauthorized installation of security camera, which Beatrice claimed was a breach of community privacy standards. It was a siege, plain and simple, a calculated attempt to break my spirit and force me to sell my house, so she could keep her perfect little kingdom free of, troublemakers, And as I watched Maya limp across the living room because her old braces were pinching her skin, the grief I'd been carrying turned into a very specific, very cold kind of focus. I realized that Beatrice didn't oppose. T feared the law because she owned the law, and she didn't oppose. T feared her neighbors because she owned their silence. So if I wanted to stop her, I couldn't oppose. to use a gavel or a badge. I had to use her own insatiable greed and her obsession with, in quote, perfection, in quote, against her. I spent the next 3 nights in my garage, door locked and windows covered, feeling like a mad scientist in a suburban thriller, reaching out to an old contact from my days working in industrial logistics, a guy named Silas who knew more about security dyes and chemical markers than anyone should legally be allowed to know. I told him I needed something that wouldn't end oppos. Stain, I needed something that wouldn't quote, marry and quote. The skin, a compound that used a silver nitrate base mixed with a high-intensity ultraviolet pigment that was invisible in normal light, but would glow like a neon sign the moment she stepped into the sun or under a black light. Silas laughed, a low, gravelly sound over the phone, and told me he had a batch of, in quote, thief trap, in quote, concentrate that was used in high-security bank bags, a deep, indelible indigo that reacted with the oils in human skin to create a bond that took weeks, not days, to fade, and he sent it to me in a plain, unlabeled thermos. The trap itself was a work of psychological art. I took a heavy, high-end box from a designer boutique, the kind of box that screamed, in quote, expensive jewelry, in quote, or, in quote, rare perfume, in quote, and I rigged a pressurized CO2 canister inside with a hair trigger micro switch connected to the lid. I didn't in oppos. T wanted to explode like a cartoon bomb. I wanted it to mist a fine, silent, pervasive fog that would coat everything within a 5-foot radius the second the seal was broken, ensuring that she wouldn't into oppos. T just get on her hands, she'd breathe it in, get in her hair, and coat that pristine mint green suit until she was a walking, talking crime scene. I spent hours testing the tension on the lid, my hands shaking with a mix of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated spite, until the mechanism was so sensitive that even a stiff breeze might set it off. And then I waited for the perfect moment. The following Tuesday was the Oak Haven, in quote, Garden Gala, in quote, the biggest social event of the year where Beatrice would lead a parade of wealthy donors and board members through the neighborhood to show off our, in quote, impeccable standards, in quote, and I knew her ego would in oppos. T let her pass my porch if she thought there was a prize to be had. At 9 a.m., I set the, in quote, golden bait, in quote, on my front mat, a beautifully gift-wrapped box with a silk ribbon and a fake invoice tucked into the side for a, in quote, custom diamond tennis bracelet, in quote. And then I went inside, sat in my darkened kitchen with a cup of black coffee, and watched the monitors. Like clockwork, the Vanderbilt SUV glided to the curb, and there she was, dressed in a stunning, snow-white Chanel-style dress, looking every bit the queen of the manor as she led a group of 5 other HOA board members toward my property line. She stopped, her eyes locking onto the box like a heat-seeking missile, and I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she explained to her, in quote, guests, in quote, that she noticed a, in quote, misplaced luxury item, in quote, that needed to be, in quote, secured for the rightful owner, in quote. She didn't in oppos to even wait to get it back to her house. Her curiosity and her sense of triumph were so overwhelming that she stepped into the shadow of my porch overhang, shielded from the street, but perfectly in view of my hidden cameras, and she pulled a ribbon. PSHHH. The sound was so faint I barely heard it through the mic, but the effect was instantaneous. A fine, shimmering cloud of indigo mist erupted from the box, swirling around her face and chest in a ghostly halo. And for a second, she just stood there, blinking, confused by the lack of a, in quote, bracelet, in quote, and the strange metallic smell in the air. She wiped her face with her white-gloved hand, leaving a faint, greasy streak that she didn't in oppos. T seemed to notice, and she quickly shoved the empty box in her oversized tote bag, smoothed her dress, and walked back to her group with that same practiced smile, unaware that she was now a ticking time bomb of chemical evidence. The beauty of the indigo compound was its, end quote, delayed darkening, in quote, property, and as the garden gala progressed under the bright, mid-morning sun, the silver nitrate began to react with the UV rays, turning from a transparent mist into a deep, bruised, metallic purple that looked like she'd been hit in the face with a bag of crushed blueberries. I followed the group at a distance, staying back in the shadows of the oak trees, watching as the other board members began to whisper and point, their faces contorting from admiration to horror as Beatrice's face slowly transformed into a mask of vibrant, glowing ink. By the time they reached the community fountain for the keynote speech, she looked like a character out of a Gothic nightmare. Her white dress was splattered with indigo and blood and her teeth were stained a pale violet from where she'd inhaled the mist, and her hands were so dark they looked like she'd been digging in coal. Beatrice, your face, One of the women gasped, her voice carrying across the manicured lawn, and as Beatrice reached up to touch her cheek, her fingers left fresh, dark smears across her forehead, causing her to let out a confused, panicked shriek that echoed off the clubhouse walls. She looked in the reflection of the fountain water and let out a sound I will never forget, a raw, guttural howl of vanity meeting its maker, as she realized that her, perfection, had been permanently, violently compromised. She tried to rub it off with her silk scarf, but the more she rubbed, the more the protein-binding dye spread, turning her entire neck and jawline into a mottled mess of indigo and black, until she looked less like a socialite and more like a captured criminal in a neon lineup. I stepped out from the crowd then, Maya's old, broken leg brace in my hand, and I walked right up to her while the entire neighborhood watched in stunned silence. The cameras of 20 different iPhones recording every second of her downfall. Beatrice, I said, my voice calm and steady, echoing in the stillness of the afternoon, I told you that those braces were important, and I told you that stealing from a child was a low, even you shooed into oppos. T sync too, but I guess you just couldn't into oppos. T help yourself, could you? And, she tried to snarl at me, tried to summon that old Vanderbilt authority, but she just looked ridiculous, a purple-faced tyrant whose reign had ended in a cloud of security dye and public shame. The police arrived 10 minutes later, called by George from across the street. And this time, they didn't in oppos. T talk about, civil matters, or lack of evidence, because the evidence was literally bonded to her DNA. They found the empty, bracelet, box in her tote bag, still leaking indigo mist, and as they led her away in handcuffs, her white dress ruined, her reputation in tatters. The silence of Oak Haven was finally broken by the sound of Maya laughing from the sidewalk. It turned out that when the police searched her storage room, they found over 200 packages she'd, collected, over the years, ranging from electronics to heirlooms to Maya's braces, which were sitting on a shelf like trophies of her petty, narcissistic war. She's currently facing multiple counts of felony mail theft and a massive civil suit that's going to strip her of that limestone fortress and every topiaried hedge she ever obsessed over. But even now, months later, people in the neighborhood still talk about the Indigo Queen, and the way she looked when the mask finally came off. I still live in Oak Haven, but the vibe has changed. The violation notices have stopped. The new HOA board is actually focused on, helping people, and I Haven and oppos. T's seen a mint green suit in the area since that day. But it makes me wonder, looking at the way everyone turned on her the moment she lost her glow, were they really better than her, or were they just waiting for someone else to take the first shot? If you found out you're perfect, neighbor was a thief, would you have the guts to rig the trap, or would you just keep your head down and hope they didn't in oppos? T pick your porch next? Let me know in the comments if you think I went too far, or if some people just need to be shown their true colors in a way they can never wash off.